When millionaire Samuel Westbrook decides to follow his maid Clara after work, he never imagines that his life will change forever. The sun had already set, and New York City was preparing for another busy night. As the lights of the buildings came on, reflecting a beauty that few had the privilege of appreciating, millionaire Samuel Westbrook, a 45-year-old man, was returning from a long day of business. His life, marked by luxury and power, had always been guided by a rigid routine. Work, commitments, and, when possible, moments in his luxury cars or on his private yacht. But that day, something out of place caught his attention. Unlike his usual nights of rest, Samuel found himself observing his maid Clara, a simple and discreet woman who always performed her tasks with a shy smile. She seemed more serious than usual as she closed the mansion's door. Samuel, curious and with a restless mind, decided to follow her discreetly after work. It was something he had never done before. She, a reserved-looking woman, had never piqued his interest so much, but something in the air that day made the scene seem different. He watched her get on a bus, and along the way she seemed lost in thought, almost as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Samuel, feeling inexplicably compelled, followed her for more than 30 minutes to a remote neighborhood of the city. As he watched her from afar, he noticed a modest, small house, without any luxury. Clara entered, and Samuel remained there, in the dead of night, with the feeling that something was about to change. It was not just curiosity that dominated him, but something deeper, as if it were the beginning of a journey that he could not avoid. What he didn't know was that that night, which began like any other, would be the turning point in his life. The story that would unfold from that moment on would make him rethink everything he thought he knew about the people around him, and about himself. What Samuel would discover in that modest neighborhood would change his life forever. Samuel Westbrook was always a man marked by success. Raised in an environment of wealth and privilege, he never had to face the day-to-day hardships that plague so many people. His world was a bubble protected by his money, his connections, and his position in society. He attended gala events, traveled to the four corners of the world, and had possessions that most people only dream of having. But contrary to what many people thought, Samuel did not see himself as a man of excess. He believed that his hard work had gotten him where he was, and that he deserved the luxury he had. However, something inside him always felt empty, something that not even his riches could fill. Clara, on the other hand, was the antithesis of Samuel. She grew up in a humble environment, where every penny counted. The daughter of immigrants, she had learned from an early age what it was like to fight for survival. Her life seemed to be made up of a series of sacrifices. She would wake up early to take care of other people's homes, but with a smile on her face and her gaze always fixed on the horizon. She didn't have great aspirations, but she dreamed of a day when things would be different, when she could see the world from the outside, experience life in a different way. Clara had a resilient spirit, and although her life was simple, she never let difficulties get her down. She had started working at Samuel's house out of necessity after losing her old job at a restaurant during the pandemic. It was worthy work, but exhausting. Over the months, she got used to the routine, cleaning, cooking, shopping, and taking care of the millionaire's house. However, as time passed, Clara began to realize that Samuel was not just a distant boss, but someone who was somehow so immersed in his own bubble that he couldn't see anything beyond it. What no one knew was that Clara had a secret that she never shared with anyone. Her past was marked by pain and struggles, and she carried a story that made her even stronger and more resilient. The house where she lived with her mother and brother was simple, but Clara's home was full of memories and a love that she never wanted to leave behind. That night, however, would be different. Samuel, with his growing curiosity, was about to discover something about Clara that would completely change his view of the world and the people he thought he knew, something he could never have imagined. As he looked around the modest house where Clara lived, Samuel wondered what could possibly be so important to her. But what he didn't know was that the little house hid a secret that would not only impact Clara's life, but his as well. Samuel's journey of discovery began to take shape, and what seemed like simple curiosity would soon turn into a profound reflection on his life and the choices he had made up until that point. What he was about to discover would challenge all his beliefs and force him to reevaluate his world. But what he finds there will leave Samuel completely speechless. The next night, Samuel could no longer shake the feeling that something was wrong. He could not understand why Clara had awakened him in this way. His world of wealth and comfort was far from the simple neighborhood where she lived, and deep down, a part of Samuel felt a strange attraction to this new world, one that he had never even considered. He knew that his life was a reflection of what he had built, but what did that really mean for other people? Determined to find out more, Samuel returned to the neighborhood, this time more cautiously. He parked his car a few blocks away and walked through the dimly lit streets until he reached Clara's house. What surprised him was the silence that enveloped the place. There was no longer the sound of the television or her hurried footsteps going from one side to the other. There was something in her demeanor that now seemed more closed off, more distant. Something was happening. As Samuel approached Clara's door, he saw her talking to a man. He was tall, with an upright posture and a serious expression. They seemed to be discussing something seriously, and Samuel, without meaning to, felt a wave of discomfort. The conversation seemed more intense than he could have imagined. There was something personal there, something Samuel couldn't understand. But what disturbed him most was the feeling that he was somehow being left out, outside a world he didn't even know existed. Watching from afar, Samuel realized that the conversation seemed more like an exchange of promises and frustrations. The man, who seemed to be an old friend of Clara's, was saying something that left her visibly disturbed. She seemed to want to push him away, but at the same time there was something about her that showed that he had a crucial importance in her life. Samuel could not understand how something as simple as a conversation could affect so much the maid who, until then, he only saw as an employee who fulfilled her obligations. The next moment was crucial. The man made a sudden gesture, placing his hand on Clara's shoulder. She tried to push him away, but he wouldn't let go. Samuel saw what seemed like a kind of desperation in Clara's eyes. She was conflicted. What he didn't know, and what she feared, was that this man was part of a chapter in her life that she preferred to keep buried. He wasn't just someone from Clara's past. He was a reminder of something dark, something that haunted her to this day. The millionaire, on a rash impulse, decided to act. He approached the door and, before thinking about the consequences, knocked. The sound echoed off the walls of a house that, inside, felt colder and more distant than he could ever imagine. Clara turned around and the expression on her face changed instantly. It was a mixture of surprise and relief, but also fear. The man next to her looked at her suspiciously, and Samuel realized that he had interrupted something much more important than he had imagined. Clara, with a trembling voice, asked Samuel to come in, but the atmosphere was already tense. The man, not wanting to get any further involved, said he had to go, and quickly left through the back door. When Samuel entered, he noticed that the atmosphere was tense. The air felt thick and Clara was visibly tense. She apologized for the situation, explaining that the man was her ex-boyfriend, who was still trying to pressure her about financial matters. He had been violent at some point in the past, but Clara had never told Samuel about it. She feared his reaction and the way he might look at her, a simple woman who had been through things he could never imagine. Samuel, surprised, sat and listened, trying to understand the pain she carried, but his mind was confused. How could he imagine that the woman who worked in his house had been through something so difficult? How could he be so far from Clara's reality, even though he lived with her every day? That night was the beginning of a new kind of relationship between Samuel and Clara. He found himself questioning his own life choices, while she tried to hide how much they affected her. Samuel didn't know how to help, but he felt that somehow he was more connected to her than he had ever been. But what Samuel didn't yet understand was the true weight that this discovery would bring to his life. Meanwhile, Clara tried to keep up the facade that everything was fine, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew that the man from her past wouldn't give up easily, and if she wasn't careful, everything Samuel had discovered could put her at risk. She knew that at that moment her life was no longer the same, and neither was Samuel's. And deep down, Clara knew that the ghosts of the past would never leave her alone. As Samuel delved deeper into Clara's life, he began to realize that the issues he thought were simple, like money and status, were in fact the smallest problems in her reality. The secret Clara carried was not limited to an abusive ex-boyfriend, but to a web of problems she had hidden from everyone, a series of complications that affected not only her life, but also the lives of her mother and brother. Samuel was beginning to realize that Clara was not just a maid who did his chores. She was the foundation of a family that struggled every day to survive. His mother, a woman in fragile health, spent her days recovering from a domestic accident that had left her with physical and emotional scars. Clara's brother, on the other hand, had been involved with drugs for some time, and despite Clara's efforts to keep him away from his addictions, the situation was getting worse every day. Meanwhile, Samuel was trying to understand his own connection to Clara. What he felt for her was no longer just curiosity. There was something deeper forming, a mix of empathy and respect he had never imagined developing for someone of his social class. He began to question the system he lived in, where everything was measured in wealth and power. He felt that somehow the lives of people like Clara were shaped by factors he had never truly understood until that moment. But the biggest challenge was yet to come. Clara's ex-boyfriend, increasingly desperate, began to pressure her in more aggressive ways. He knew that Clara had something he wanted, her father's inheritance. Although Clara had never spoken about it directly, Samuel had learned from indirect sources that the inheritance was significant. It was money she could use to escape the clutches of her past. But no matter how hard she tried to protect her family, her ex-boyfriend began to threaten her mother and brother, using psychological and physical violence to force Clara to hand over what he believed was her right. Clara, as much as she wanted to seek help, knew that her involvement with Samuel could complicate her situation even further. She feared that Samuel would become a target of her ex-boyfriend, and without knowing it, drag him into the abyss of his life. Therefore, she made difficult decisions, trying to protect everyone around her without asking for help. Meanwhile, Samuel, immersed in his own dilemmas, was beginning to understand that his love for Clara was not just about affection, but about a deep recognition of her strength and resilience. But what he didn't know was that he would also become part of an even greater conflict. Clara could no longer hide the magnitude of what she was facing. It was then that he began to investigate Clara's past more deeply, realizing that her situation was much more dangerous than he had imagined. Her ex-boyfriend was not just an isolated figure. He was involved in circles of influential and dangerous people, and the threat that loomed was very real. Samuel, however, found himself torn between the need to protect Clara and the difficulty of accepting that he too would be hit by the approaching hurricane. He began to reflect on what it really meant to live in a world where wealth and power were within the reach of a few, but did not bring security to those who needed it most. The subplots that began to develop, her mother's health problems, the tensions with her brother, Clara's involvement with dangerous people, began to affect not only the protagonist, but also Samuel in unexpected ways. He didn't know if he was prepared to deal with all of this. His comfortable, controlled life was beginning to crumble before his eyes. Clara's dilemma was simple, but at the same time devastating. How to protect her family without losing hope that one day she would be able to free herself from the cycle of suffering that haunted her. And Samuel, realizing the magnitude of his struggles, began to understand that he could not be the hero she needed, not without facing his own dark side and the limits of his privilege. And as Samuel and Clara began to understand the complexity of the situation they were involved in, time was running out. Clara's ex-boyfriend was not willing to wait. He was determined to do whatever it took to get the control he so desperately wanted. Now, Samuel and Clara were not just victims of the past, but key players in a fight much bigger than either of them imagined. The tension in the quiet streets of Clara's neighborhood was already palpable. Samuel felt the weight of what was to come. The situation was becoming untenable, and he was beginning to realize that nothing in his life had prepared him for what he was about to face. Clara's world, a world he was only beginning to understand, was in danger, and he no longer knew how to deal with it. Every decision, every step seemed more fraught with consequences, and Samuel didn't know which was the best choice. That night, Clara called him for a talk. Something was about to happen. The man from her past, her ex-boyfriend, had approached her once again. But now the threats were no longer just empty words. Samuel had learned from outside sources that the man had allied himself with powerful people, with connections and influence, that could put everything Samuel and Clara knew at risk. Clara was at her limit. She knew that no matter how hard she tried to protect Samuel, he was now as entangled in this web of lies and dangers as she was. Her ex-boyfriend had found a way to infiltrate her life in more insidious ways, manipulating situations and creating an environment where escape seemed impossible. He had begun to threaten Clara's mother's life, saying that she would be the next victim if Clara did not hand over the inheritance that he believed was hers. Their conversation that night was tense, and Clara finally gave in to her fear. She knew that what was happening could not continue. The only way to protect everyone was to confront her ex-boyfriend once and for all. Samuel, who until then had seen himself as a helpless observer, had no choice but to dive headfirst into this chaotic world. The idea of leaving Clara and her family to face this alone was unthinkable. But Samuel was not a man of impulsive action. He always calculated his moves, meticulously planning every move. But this was no longer the business game he knew how to play. Clara had drawn him into an emotional confrontation, a confrontation that required courage but also boldness. And he knew that if he did this, there would be no going back. They had one chance. Clara's ex-boyfriend had unknowingly made a mistake. He had underestimated Samuel. Thinking that the millionaire would never get directly involved, the ex-boyfriend was starting to feel too comfortable. He believed that with his threats, he could manipulate the situation as he wished. At that point, Samuel decided to take action. He would use his resources, his connections, and his intelligence to turn the tide. However, it would not be that simple. The pressure was overwhelming. It was not just a matter of taking down a ruthless man. Samuel was taking on a system that had existed long before him, a system that maintained the cycle of power and fear that Clara was trying to break. Samuel's plan wasn't simple. He needed to involve the police, but at the same time, he had to make sure that Clara and her family were safe before any action was taken. Plus, there was the issue of the inheritance. Samuel didn't know how important it really was to Clara's survival. He needed to know that to calculate the risk. Every step he took made the risk of failure increase exponentially. The tension between Samuel and Clara was growing. She felt guilty for dragging him into this mess. She knew Samuel was getting into a situation he never wanted to be in, and she didn't want him to put himself at risk for her sake. But there was something about Samuel now that she had never seen before. He was willing to sacrifice everything to help her. But what Clara didn't know was that Samuel was more emotionally involved than she had imagined. He was beginning to realize that it wasn't just empathy for her that drove him. He had fallen in love, but this love was more complex than anything he had ever known. He wasn't the perfect savior she thought. He was, in fact, more fragile than she had imagined. As the plan took shape, the pressure mounted. Clara's ex-boyfriend, now more daring, was getting closer. Samuel and Clara were about to take the riskiest step of their lives, but they didn't know how far it would take them. Everyone's fate was about to be decided. But the real question was, could Samuel actually save Clara? Or was he just digging an even deeper hole for everyone? Samuel's plan began to unfold with clockwork precision, but as always happens when you tamper with the shadows of the past, the consequences were swift and brutal. He had assembled an army of lawyers and influential contacts to pressure Clara's ex-boyfriend. The idea was simple: destabilize him financially, strip him of whatever power he still held, while the police took steps to ensure the safety of Clara and her family. But as Samuel would soon discover, the game he was playing was not simple. Clara's ex-boyfriend, with his network of dangerous contacts, was more prepared than they realized. Samuel underestimated the size of the monster he was trying to take on. When the first move was made, a freeze on bank accounts, a false accusation, and a threat to expose some of his illegal business dealings, the ex-boyfriend reacted violently. He knew what Samuel was trying to do, and the war now was at an irreversible point. That night, Clara received an unexpected phone call. It was her mother, desperate, screaming on the phone. The man Clara had feared so much had infiltrated her life even further. He had found a way to get to her, forcing Clara to face the reality that the fear she had carried for so long would not be easily erased. Samuel, upon receiving the news that Clara's mother was in serious condition after a panic attack, immediately tried to contact the police, but the problems were piling up at a speed no one could have predicted. Clara, still in shock, asked Samuel to leave her life. She was convinced that her presence was putting his life even more at risk. But Samuel, in an act of impulsiveness, refused. He would not abandon her no matter what. The love he felt for her now went beyond a simple desire for protection. It was a visceral connection that he could not deny, even when danger was so close. With Clara's mother in critical condition and her brother unsure of how to handle the situation, Clara had to make a difficult decision. She knew that if she didn't act, Samuel could be dragged into a never-ending spiral of violence. Her ex-boyfriend was no longer just an angry man. He had become a constant threat, and Samuel's power, so present in her life as a millionaire, was making no difference in that fight. The showdown was approaching, but Samuel had not yet faced the true consequences of his choices. What he did not know was that the cards were being played cruelly. In a last attempt to destabilize Samuel, Clara's ex-boyfriend, in a desperate move, used the only thing he knew could destroy the millionaire, Clara's inheritance. He claimed that Samuel was trying to steal his share of the inheritance, creating a public scandal. Social media, which had previously been just a reflection of Samuel's world, was now becoming a battlefield. The scandal began to gain momentum, and the consequences soon affected Samuel's reputation. He began to receive threats from all sides, and the weight of the struggle he had brought upon himself became even more present. He was now seen as a villain, no longer the hero he had imagined himself to be. The real backlash came when the police finally got involved. Clara's ex-boyfriend was arrested, but not before leaving a deep scar on everyone involved. Clara, as relieved as she was, couldn't help but feel that something had been irreparably broken. She knew Samuel had sacrificed himself for her, but the damage done was irreversible. The price of what Samuel had done to help her was too high. When Samuel was faced with the public backlash over his involvement with Clara and her family, he realized there was no turning back. His life, which had always been defined by his ability to control everything around him, was now out of control. The pain Clara felt when she looked at him was the same pain he felt for her. They were both scarred by a world they never chose, but now had to face head-on. The tension and ripple effects that followed the confrontation changed the dynamic between Samuel and Clara forever. Clara's battle was not over, and the consequences of Samuel's choices affected not only him, but everyone around him. He began to understand that all the money or power in the world could not protect him from a fate that was already set for him and Clara. What remained now was to face the consequences of what they had done, and they both knew that the marks left by this battle would be difficult to erase. With the weight of choices weighing on both of their shoulders, Samuel and Clara began to realize that the real battle was not just about beating Clara's ex-boyfriend or cleaning up the damage caused by public exposure. The real fight, the one no one had prepared them to face, was the internal battle, the one that took place in the recesses of their hearts and minds. For Clara, overcoming wasn't just about finding a solution to external problems. What she wanted most now was to rebuild her life so that she could finally free herself from the chains of her past. She knew that her life would never be simple. The scars of violence, the constant fear, and the feeling of helplessness that she carried would always be part of her story. But there was something more to her journey, something that she couldn't fully understand until that moment. As Clara looked at Samuel, she realized he wasn't the man she had initially imagined. That cold, distant millionaire. Samuel was a man of flesh and blood, with his own wounds, his own fears and insecurities. He wasn't a hero, not anymore. He was struggling just like her to find a way through the chaos. And somehow Clara began to understand that together, they could build something new, something that would never depend on money or status, but on something deeper, understanding and partnership. The pain Samuel felt for having put Clara and her family at risk was immense. He could no longer go back and erase what he had done. But as he watched Clara, he began to realize that there was something more important than any material loss or any title he held: human connection. He realized that the true richness of his life was not in the possessions he had accumulated, but in the opportunity to truly live alongside someone, to be part of another person's struggle. Clara, with her vulnerability and strength, had helped him see a world beyond the one he had known. Samuel could no longer see life the same way. He felt a growing desire to use his wealth, not to feed his ego or status, but to do something meaningful. He knew that his journey of growth would be long and difficult, but now he was willing to face his own demons. He needed to learn to free himself from the superficial world that surrounded him, the one that made him believe that power and wealth were the only things that mattered. Now he knew that there was something much more valuable to be achieved: authenticity, confidence, and most importantly, the ability to love without fear. Clara, in turn, found strength in the small victories that previously went unnoticed. She was no longer just focused on escaping the past. She was determined to face the ghosts that haunted her, no longer allowing herself to be consumed by guilt or fear. With Samuel's support, she found a new purpose in her life, a purpose that did not depend on anyone else but came from within herself. She learned that true overcoming came from accepting her weaknesses and using them as fuel for her strength. Both were now on a path of self-discovery, where the losses were still felt, but no longer dominated their existences. Clara and Samuel, even with all the scars they carried, began to build something stronger than any fortress of wealth or power: a genuine relationship based on understanding and mutual support. The real change, for both of them, began to happen when they understood that despite all the adversities, life could still be lived to the fullest. It was no longer about running away from the consequences, but about embracing the journey, with its ups and downs. Samuel and Clara, in their search for redemption, discovered that life is never a straight line. It is a winding path, full of obstacles, but also moments of unexpected beauty and growth. It was from this acceptance that they both began to understand what it meant to truly overcome. It wasn't a victory over the enemy or a fight against fate. It was the victory of learning to be vulnerable, of opening yourself up to others, and allowing yourself to be transformed by the experience. As the world around them continued to spin, with its complexities and challenges, Samuel and Clara realized that, in the end, the greatest gift they could give each other was the space to grow, to learn, and to start over, without fear of what would come next. Now more than ever, Samuel and Clara knew that the future was not a promise, but a choice, and they were ready to make their choices together. Time was running out. Samuel and Clara had gained something very valuable in the weeks since their confrontation with Clara's ex-boyfriend, a renewed sense of partnership and mutual understanding. But as always happens when things finally seem to be on the right track, a new storm was brewing on the horizon. The scars of the past were still deep, and the danger was still very real. Clara's ex-boyfriend, though in prison, had left a trail of destruction in his wake. Even with the authorities now involved, his influence was still everywhere, with people willing to do whatever it took to ensure his release. Clara knew she could not rest, that the battle was not over yet. She feared that even with Samuel's support, their future was still in jeopardy. Samuel, for his part, was more determined than ever to ensure Clara's safety, but he also knew that the real threat didn't come from his ex-boyfriend alone. What he couldn't ignore was the fact that his actions, his attempts to save Clara, had in some way been an attempt to replace his own flaws and fears. He was unwittingly trying to redeem himself from a world he had helped create. The fight for Clara's life, in the end, was also a fight for his own identity. They stood on the brink, prepared for what could be their final confrontation with the past. The truth was about to be revealed, and their fate was about to be sealed. Samuel knew that the only way to complete this journey was to face the mistakes of his past head-on, without fear of the consequences. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed Clara, more than ever, by his side. Clara, for her part, had finally accepted that she could not carry the weight of the world alone. The fear she felt for her family's safety was still present, but she knew that now was the time to fight, to face the past with courage. She also knew that with Samuel by her side, she did not have to be a hero alone. They were a team, and their fates were now unbreakably intertwined. The police, now aware of the magnitude of what had happened, prepared for the final operation. Clara's ex-boyfriend was in a maximum security prison, but his allies were still at large, ready for anything. Samuel, with all the financial and legal resources at his disposal, had ensured that Clara was in a safe place, but he also knew that nothing could be guaranteed if they did not act quickly. Anxiety was in the air. Each step Samuel took toward Clara's safety seemed to carry an increasing weight. He knew the only way to ensure everyone's safety was to act now, with courage and determination. The final operation was underway, but the tension was palpable. The safety of Clara, her mother and her brother still depended on Samuel's decisive action. But there was one last twist that no one could have foreseen. Clara's ex-boyfriend, even though he was in prison, still had a hidden ace in the hole. One last card to play. Samuel and Clara, now closer than ever, were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives, the decisive moment where all the choices they had made up until that point converged. They didn't know how the future would unfold, but they knew it would be a fight for survival, for justice and for freedom. Clara felt the pressure was on. Every decision was now crucial. She knew that no matter what happened, the fight for her own life and the safety of those she loved would never end. Samuel, by her side, was prepared for anything, knowing that the true victory would not lie in gaining safety or control, but in the peace they would finally begin to find as they faced the shadows of their pasts. The preparation was complete. They were ready for what was to come next. The approaching night was fraught with tension. Samuel and Clara were just one step away from finally facing Clara's ex-boyfriend and his allies, who had infiltrated her life once again. The police operation was underway, but to Samuel, It felt like every second was dragging on. He knew that no matter what happened, the final fight was about to happen, and no one could predict what would emerge from the shadows. Clara stood beside Samuel, stronger than ever. She had spent so long trying to protect herself from her past that now she was ready to confront it. She knew it could mean the end of everything she had ever known, but she also felt it was the only way she could truly break free. The time had come to take a definitive step. The tension was palpable as they both waited for the signal to act. Samuel felt an anger he had never experienced before. This man who had done so much harm to Clara and her family, and whom he had tried to confront in so many ways, was now about to pay the price for everything. But at the same time, something in Samuel questioned what had really been achieved so far. He was no longer the unbeatable millionaire he once was. He was just a man trying to redeem himself, trying to correct the mistakes of his life. Suddenly, the first explosion happened. The sound reverberated in the air and Samuel's heart raced. The operation was underway, but Clara's ex-boyfriend, even while in prison, had planned one last move, a deadly blow to anyone who dared to challenge his power. He had allies inside the prison, and those allies were ready to do whatever it took to free him. Clara shuddered as she realized what was happening. They had underestimated the power of her ex-boyfriend, not just him, but also the criminal connections he had. Suddenly, the security they believed they had was compromised. The police, who were supposed to protect Clara and her family, were fighting against what seemed like an invisible and unstoppable force. Samuel immediately pulled Clara to a safe corner of the house where they were staying. He knew that the only way to survive now was to act quickly, and the clock was ticking. The police had been caught off guard, and Clara's ex-boyfriend was closer to getting what he wanted than anyone imagined. Allies inside the prison had infiltrated every move of the operation, turning it into a real trap. The ex-boyfriend's last move was a direct attack on Clara's house, where they were staying. The men he had sent were prepared to take everything that was valuable, not only Clara's inheritance, but also the safety of everyone involved. They were willing to do anything, and there was no time to hesitate. Clara, feeling the pressure building, turned to Samuel. She knew he was not prepared for this kind of violence, and even more, she knew he could not get away with it. Samuel had never faced anything so visceral, so real. His world of luxury and control was disintegrating before his eyes, and he was about to lose everything, including Clara, if he didn't act. The police finally arrived on the scene, but chaos had already ensued. A shootout began, and Samuel found himself in a situation he had never imagined. He had to protect Clara with his own life. He was far from the movie hero he imagined himself to be. Samuel was just a man fighting for something bigger than himself, something that not even money could save: Clara's love and life. In the midst of the confusion, a scream echoed, a scream that froze Samuel's blood. It was Clara, lying on the ground. Clara's ex-boyfriend, in a last desperate act, had invaded the place and injured Clara in the process. He, like a cornered animal, attacked anyone who got in his way. Clara, with blood running down her face, looked at Samuel, her expression a mixture of pain and acceptance. "Samuel, no," she whispered, but Samuel didn't hear. He was in survival mode now. He grabbed Clara and dragged her to safety, his mind clouded with adrenaline and fear. He knew that if he didn't act fast, she could die right there in his arms. The final confrontation was taking place. Samuel, in an instinctive gesture, used all his power of influence to bring down Clara's ex-boyfriend and his accomplices. There was no more room for negotiations or diplomacy. It was a fight for Clara's life, and for his own redemption. When the police finally arrived to capture the criminals, silence fell. The battle was won, but the price was very high. Clara was seriously injured, and Samuel, even victorious, knew that nothing could erase what had happened there. They had won, but what they had lost in the process was irreparable. Clara, with a pained but serene expression, looked at Samuel. She knew he had given everything he had to save her, but something in his eyes told her they were far from victorious. Their battle would never truly be won, but somehow the confrontation had changed them forever. The post-battle silence was heavy and unbearable. Samuel lay beside Clara, now in a hospital bed, her breathing shallow and her body covered in bandages. Clara's ex-boyfriend, his accomplices, and everyone involved had finally been captured, but the price of victory seemed irretrievable. Samuel knew there were no heroes in this story, only survivors. They had emerged victorious, but the scars of what had happened were forever etched in their hearts. Clara, her eyes closed, was still breathing heavily, but Samuel could see something else in her face. It wasn't just pain. There was an acceptance, a certain peace that she seemed to have achieved amidst the chaos. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that life would never be the same again, but she also understood that finally, she had greater control over her own destiny. What had happened to her family, and to Samuel could not be erased, but that didn't mean that pain would have the last word. Samuel, on the other hand, felt lost. He could never go back to being the man he once was. The millionaire who believed that money and power could solve anything. The hardships Clara and her family had faced, and his own decisions, had changed everything he believed was right. He now knew that the true value of life was not measured by wealth, but by the ability to make a difference in someone else's life. But most importantly, Samuel now understood that there was no redemption without sacrifice. He had to step away from the world that defined him, face his own mistakes, and in a gesture of true courage, he had exposed himself to Clara and everyone around him. He was ready to make a real change, not only for himself, but for those he loved. When Clara finally woke up, her eyes met Samuel's, and instead of words, a simple touch of the hand between them was enough to express everything that had been lost, and all that hope remained. They didn't need any more promises or explanations. They knew now that true healing would be a long journey, but it began here, together. Clara's ex-boyfriend was behind bars, and the impact of his actions would reverberate for a long time. But the real fight for Samuel and Clara was about rebuilding the broken parts of themselves one piece at a time. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: nothing would be taken for granted anymore. Love, trust, true freedom, all of these would be earned day by day as they faced the scars of their past. Their journey was just beginning, but finally, with the weight of the past starting to be left behind, Samuel and Clara were ready to take the first step toward a life that could now be truer and more meaningful. Months have passed since that fateful night. Samuel and Clara, although still marked by the scars of the past, had begun to rebuild their lives. Clara found a new purpose, far from the shadow of her old fears, and Samuel, now more humble and introspective, dedicated himself to causes he had never imagined before. Together, they had learned that true victories come not from control, but from the courage to open up and fight, not only for themselves but for others. Life, finally, was beginning to feel like a place where they could create something real and lasting, something worthwhile. Samuel and Clara's journey was intense, full of twists and turns and life lessons, but their story doesn't end there. If you were moved, reflected on life's challenges, and want to follow more stories of overcoming, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone you think also needs to hear this message of strength and transformation. And if you haven't watched other videos about stories of change and redemption, take the opportunity to check them out. The path to true freedom is long, but together we can learn with each step. Until next time.